Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm the co-owner and CEO with Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We have, over the last 13 years, helped life science companies from across the globe do everything from virtualize their advisory board meetings, medical education events, publication groups, investigator meetings. We've even helped people with big corporate events, sales training, and everything in between with our Insight platforms and our Insight events platform. But more importantly, we really believe at Impetus that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations, we can work with the leading edge thinkers, the digital provocateurs, the entrepreneurs, to really work to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. But not only do we need to start the conversation, but we need to sustain it over time. This is precisely the reason that we do our series of touch points through the Impetus Insight platform, so that we can build the momentum behind the ideas, the consensus, the driving force behind really changing and moving agendas forward. I'm really thrilled to actually have one of these really leading edge thinkers at the digital table with us today. And this is actually Tjaša Zajc, and really excited about what she's doing. She has all kinds of experience with medicine and she's also a healthcare journalist, as well as she is a chronic disease patient herself. She actually is going to be able to give us a unique perspective on doctors and policymakers, and at the same time, really delving into her experience as a chronic condition patient. In 2015, Tjaša began noticing the really slow emergence of digital health, and she decided to get really immersed in the international digital health scene. She started with something called Faces of Digital Health. This is a podcast that she runs, so check it out if you would like to get into that. Which she started in 2017 to really explore the speed at which healthcare systems around the world are adopting digital transformation. This podcast that she runs steers away from American centricity, which is really kind of nice to see for a change, and is really reporting about digital health and aims to give medical professionals and decision makers some insights into the latest digital health trends, not just in America, but across the globe. So Tjaša is also the community developer and communication specialist of a company called MedsClub, an international community of pharmacists, doctors, and nurses who are all exploring some of the best digital practices for better medication-related patient safety. So Tjaša, welcome. So happy to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's awesome. So what an interesting journey. Obviously, having been a patient yourself, and then getting really intrigued and interested in digital transformation as it relates to healthcare. Maybe we can start this discussion, Tjaša, with a little bit of background on what got you to where you are today.
Okay, so I knew fairly early on that I wanted to be a journalist. I actually started thinking about that when I was already in high school. So I started working for the local newspaper, local radio. And then when I went to the university, one of the jobs that I had was with the national weekly magazine, quite reputable here in Slovenia. And at the time, the editor told me, you have to specialize, you can't just cover everything, but you have to specialize. And we currently don't have anyone that's really focused on healthcare and education. And I thought, okay, so, I'm a chronic patient. I got diagnosed with IBD when I was 14, and it seemed quite logical to me that I might go into healthcare a little bit more. So when I finished my degree in journalism, I decided to do a master's in healthcare management and economics, because I I thought, that's going to give me a unique perspective and the understanding of how healthcare actually works. From the one side, most of us look at healthcare from the patient perspective, but there's all sorts of politics and forces working in the background that are causing things to be as they are. So I did that. I didn't get a job with that magazine, but instead I was employed by a medical monthly, so a magazine dedicated to doctors, where the reporting was all about the latest medical trends. So new medications, new protocols, also something about policy, but really focused on the doctor's perspective and medicine. The general guideline somehow was, how can we bring what specialists are doing and the latest trends that specialists are exploring and are immersed in their everyday work, how can we create meaningful content for primary care physicians, that have to have a really broad understanding of the latest trends in medicine. So that was again a third perspective, because I mostly had interviews with doctors. We had to go to conferences that were focused on the latest novelties in the pharmaceutical industry. So now I had kind of the three perspectives. And I think that was a great start for me when I also started assessing how technology is entering healthcare, because sometimes it's really hard to assess if a certain innovation, how fast will it be adopted, or will it translate into the clinical practice, because there's so many human factors that impact the adoption in the end.
Absolutely. Sounds absolutely fascinating. So a lot of different things that we'll be able to dig into here. So just curious, and without getting into too much detail about your personal situation. So as a typical IBD patient or somebody who is dealing with a chronic condition, what have you or some of the people that you have spoken to from a patient perspective are finding is currently some of the things that are missing in the systems that we're using today in healthcare?
I think an interesting aspect of chronic patients is that your perception of the disease really changes over time. Especially, obviously, it depends on the state. If you have, if you're a little bit worse and the disease is active, it's different than when it's not active. But in general, it very soon becomes just a part of you while you're leading your daily life. So from that perspective, I think it's sometimes good to kind of remind patients that they do need to take their disease seriously, because I have been a chronic patient for 17 years, and at the beginning it's you face most unknown situations. You don't know what the disease is, you don't know what can happen, you don't know anything. So at that time it's really good to have a lot of information, and we have that a lot of that today with digital health and just the communication tools. But then over time you get used to it. You can very quickly think that you know the disease and how to manage it better than doctors. And when that happens, I think we just need perhaps some sort of a reminder, or that maybe, you don't know as much as you know, although chronic patients do know enough, but there's a danger of overconfidence about how should you manage your care. And I think that's kind of an important thing, maybe not addressed that much, because that depending on how you perceive your state, that's gonna determine how fast you're gonna go to the doctor, how fast you're gonna look for care, and what your outcomes will be. So that's just maybe one thing that I can think of.
It's a very interesting point, Tjaša, and the reason I think it is so intriguing is we're currently looking in the face of COVID-19 currently. And this still is very much in the pandemic, excruciating emergency, all the bells and whistles are going off all, 24/7. But at the same time, you're seeing other countries like Israel or in the US, for example, where they're sort of emerging, if you will, out of the thinking. Now, what's interesting about that is they're saying just recently, and it's some statistics, that there's a large proportion of patients in the US who are not going for their second COVID-19 vaccine dose.
Mm-hmm.
So in a very similar way to what you were just saying, is that we go into a panic when we first learn about our disease, or we first learn about our condition. We do everything that we need to fix it, do it. And then very quickly, we reach that place of almost like disintegration with our interest or care for what is going on or it's taken care of. Can you sort of speak to the potential parallels there on, and what you sort of see is, is happening with some of these COVID-19 patients as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe here I could draw a parallel more to the journalism and how journalistic reporting usually works and is responded to. Anytime a war happens, at the beginning, there's huge interest in that reporting. But when you hear about that war over and over again, and especially if it's far away from where you live, and you've got tons of other problems that you need to think of, that's where the fatigue happens. It's similar to the alert fatigue that doctors are faced with in IT systems. It's just you get used to it, I guess, to the idea. And as long as you're not affected, you lose interest in it. And I think that's something that we see with COVID. People see their friends that are in the less risk groups, and they potentially got COVID, didn't have problems, and they then extrapolate or lose the fear of the disease because they know one person that had it easy. And they don't think about everyone that's been in the hospital. They don't think about the cases that were not as lucky. And the challenge, I guess, is that there's no way really to predict how the disease is going to affect you. So that kind of would be my short answer. I could go on, but
Well, it's a really interesting comment because I think there's a lot of psychology there. They call that inattentional blindness. If anybody's ever heard the story of the gorilla that actually came in amidst a group of people that were passing a ball around, when you get so focused and concentrated on other things, because our brain is very energy depleting, it only tries to focus on things that needs immediate attention and forgets about everything else. So just like somebody touching their face constantly, after a while, you just stop feeling it. So I think it's the same concept of unintentional blindness. Just switching gears a little bit, Tjaša. So you're working for a really interesting company called Better. And the company Better actually has some interesting products. And I was wondering if we can kind of delve into them a little bit and see how they're applying into the healthcare space. So the first one really is about the Better platform. And this is really something that's being used almost like an electronic health record. Can you describe to the audience what the purpose of this is, and how is this differentiated from all the other electronic health records that are in the market right now?
Mm-hmm. So thank you for that question. Basically, the Better platform is based on an OpenEHR standard. That's an open standard, which doesn't mean that data that's saved in the platform is freely available. It just means that it's in such a format that it's vendor independent. The biggest challenge that healthcare currently has when it comes to electronic healthcare record is that the data is locked in the systems. So for example, if you have an Epic system and you want it to go to the Cerner system, it's such a nightmare that it's close to impossible, because you would have to migrate the data from one system to another system. And that would be a huge project. It would cost a lot. It definitely wouldn't be for free. For comparison and in contrast, when you build a data platform on a vendor neutral format, that means that the data is independent of the applications of the platform. So for example, if Better for some reason stops existing, somebody can just take another data platform that's based on open standards, clinicians, hospitals can extrapolate the data, they can analyze the data, whereas when you have vendor dependent platforms, you can't really do that. So that's a huge difference, which is also why a lot of countries, Slovenia, Malta, we're moving to Spain now. In the NHS, the platform is used in quite a few hospitals because it's practical to have access to the data and decide based on your own needs what you want to analyze. That's
So
kind
with
of the
that
short.
question, Tjaša, so is there a certain level of interoperability that is built into the system as a result of the fact that it's not built on a specific vendor's framework? How does that work? And I think the only other question that may come up when you use the word, and again, it's probably not attributed to this idea of open source or open code, people immediately think of, security, safety, of the data integrity, and what that looks like. So, and again, a great example of this is the fact of the Apple ecosystem. Because it's a closed system and it's not necessarily interoperable with others, people deem that, correct or not, that it's a safer system.
Mm-hmm. So basically, when it comes to interoperability, I guess the interoperability or data structure has several layers. One is how you transfer the information from one hospital to another. The second one is how the data is structured at its core. And the benefit here is that the OpenEHR standard archetypes, data models, they are designed by clinicians for clinicians. So they have a very long durability. And all the data models are governed by a nonprofit organization called the OpenEHR Foundation. So that's kind of the main difference. When you have different hospitals that all use OpenEHR, the data exchange is fairly simple. Does that answer your question a little bit?
And that makes sense. So tapping into that a little bit, Tjaša. So if there is this movability, if you will, or this fluidity of the data flow, almost what we calling it being able to leverage like a data lake, does this impact the way physicians, researchers, manufacturers, and other interested stakeholders, does it allow an accessibility to data or aggregated data for analysis, advanced analytics? Tell us a little bit about how that works, and the access to those data lakes.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's exactly how you described it. I'm trying to, okay, so for example, if you take your health app on your iPhone, you've got the preset of analytics and what you can see. And that's kind of the case with a lot of applications. They offer additional analytics, but it's the analytics that they, so the inventors, the vendors decide that might be useful for you. Whereas when you use the OpenEHR format, you can do all sorts of analysis. Obviously, you have to design the algorithms about what you're interested in, and that's what hospitals do on their own. But the main point is that they can access the data. And that's very valuable, exactly for the purposes that you mentioned.
And this is actually one of the issues, I think, that are being run into in so many other areas around the globe, including North America, et cetera, where there's closure and there's a privacy associated with these data lakes. And it's really difficult to be able to devise innovation very rapidly because these really important information are locked. So it's really neat to see what's going on with the Better platform. Mm-hmm. One of the other things as well, too, that your company is working on is something called BetterMeds. It's almost like a medication management type of tool. Can you tell us a little bit about what BetterMeds is all about?
Okay, so every hospital has tens or hundreds of IT systems for different purposes, for different specialties. Different doctors have different needs, but one need that's probably common to all the wards that are in the hospital is how to manage medications. So when you're admitted to the hospital, the doctor asks you about your medication history, and you have to have an IT system that allows doctors to input the medications that you're taking, that allows clinical pharmacists to check if the prescriptions that the doctor made, if they're correct, if something needs to be changed, if the doses are okay, because they're, better specialists when it comes to prescribing and medications compared to doctors. And then you've got nurses that are in charge of administering those drugs. So that's basically what BetterMeds offers. There's a lot of competitors on the market. They do things in different ways, but you have to have a robust management system in every hospital, so it's clear which patient got which drug at which time, was the dose missed. And if you imagine elderly patients or complex patients with multiple comorbidities, they can have 15 to 20 or more different medications, and you have to have an efficient system in how to manage that.
Now, is this the same system that Better is calling or referring to the Pathfinder, or is that a specific patient tool that helps with things like chronic disease management registries? Can you speak a little bit about the Pathfinder platform?
Sure. So Pathfinder is more like an EHR. So it's the patient portal where we've got basic information about the patient, whereas BetterMeds is focused strictly on medications. And they're both connected. But for example, BetterMeds is a standalone product that can be embedded in other patient portals as well, because hospitals usually already have that. And they just need the medication management portal. We see that a lot, especially in the UK, where there's huge strides in digitalization, and also a lot of funding provided for the hospitals to enable them to actually implement these solutions.
Absolutely. Now, COVID-19 has turned the world upside down. We're never going to be the same after all of this. There's some silver linings. There's obviously some tragedies as well. But I was just curious with the company Better, what has happened? What has either accelerated or put into demise or to bed for your company since the arising of this pandemic?
I think the main thing that has changed is the larger realization or larger interest, I would say, about the importance of having a good data platform and data structure. So we knew, for a long time how useful digitalization can be, that you need data in order to enable these things. But because of COVID, that need suddenly became immediate. So that interest really accelerated. And as we've seen everywhere else in healthcare, a lot of funding is now being kind of also almost thrown into healthcare and digital health, to make solutions as good as possible, to enable innovation and to enable adoption. So that's the main thing, I would say.
Fantastic. You have a really big vested interest in all things medication. It's kind of what you do it better, but you're also involved with something else called MedsClub. Can you describe what this club is, who should be joining it, and really what your role is in the MedsClub?
Okay, so MedsClub is basically part of Better. Last year, we decided that we're going to start running a community for our users. So MedsClub is basically a community of clinicians that are interested in patient safety related to medication management and how digital technologies could improve medical adherence, medication adherence, prescribing, everything that you can think of, because there's new solutions coming on the market every day. And the main point of the MedsClub is to kind of encourage knowledge sharing through through partnerships, through just the meetings that we organize once a month, because a huge challenge when it comes to digital health, and especially healthcare IT and digitalization of healthcare in systems such as the primary care, when we're talking about professional institutions, not just patients, then the challenge becomes, how are you going to encourage adoption, and how are you going to get to the implementation of the systems? Because it's not just about bringing a software and deploying it in the hospital. You need to prepare staff for the system, you need to train staff, you need to have doctors on your side, you have to have clinical champions on your side in order for this to be successful. So a lot of challenges arise there, and we created this community to enable knowledge sharing between those that have already implemented the systems and those that are hardly on their way. Perhaps as an interesting thought, when a hospital decides to buy, let's say, a medication management system, it usually takes 18 months or even more from the procurement phase to the actual implementation phase. It's possible to do it in a shorter period. One of the hospitals that was the last to implement our system actually managed to do it in 6 months, 9 if we also count the procurement phase. But I think the time frame alone tells you that there has to be a lot that happens in the background in order for these things to work. And because there's a lot, there's also a lot of challenges, and we're trying to address those challenges through the community. And I think the really interesting thing is that most of our customers at the moment are in the UK. We have some customers in Slovenia. We're now running a pilot project in New Zealand. And my interest in general in the podcast is to look at healthcare globally, to see how different cultures, how different people think. And slowly, we are also going to get to those cultural exchanges in the community, where it's going to be interesting to see how, for example, clinicians in the UK are addressing some issues, and how the people in New Zealand are approaching solving some issues. Because if you look at medicine, there's always huge differences in terms of even clinical standards. So knowledge sharing is always very welcome, I think.
So Tjaša, just so I understand, so the MedsClub is geared to a physician community or to a patient community?
It's clinicians in the hospitals. So at the moment we have users of our systems. So the members at the moment are actually pharmacists. We mostly have pharmacists, some nurses, some doctors, but pharmacists that are in charge for the implementation of these systems.
Got it. I understand what you're saying. Yes. So since COVID-19, has the messaging, the discussion, the support that you're providing to, again, this community, probably mostly comprised of pharmacists, has it changed at all, or has it evolved?
From the community perspective, we started building the community in May last year, and now the membership is growing. We also, for me as the community developer, which is my role, I didn't mention that before, but for me, I am also trying to figure out every day what's the best value for the users, how we can best support them. So the community is basically a support mechanisms to make clinicians easier to deal with the digitalization, which is, healthcare IT can be interesting for some. It can be scary or annoying for others. We know about all the issues related to clinical burnout because of IT, and we're just trying to look at it through all aspects in the community.
Yeah, we completely understand that. I mean, we do that actually at Impetus. So same thing you're talking about, community engagement. We do this for life science companies, but we find that we have to do a series of touch points with specific call to actions and exercises and questions throughout the year. We do that asynchronously and synchronously as well, very similar to what you're doing in your portal. So we should probably talk at some point. We can potentially help to support you. So really interested also around your podcast. So there's been a lot of really interesting topics, and I love the overarching rationale for you starting this podcast. And I'm assuming it's under the banner of Better, with more outreach. Tell us a little bit around the importance of understanding international culture, ideas, differences in approaches, and why sort of the standard, North American viewpoint doesn't necessarily apply to Slovenia or New Zealand, India, or other places that you are interacting.
Okay, so let me just go a step back to how the podcast came into existence. I actually started it while I was still working as a journalist at that medical journal called Medicine Today in translation. And the reason I started it was because in the middle of my job, my boyfriend and I decided to hike the continental divide in the US. So going from Mexico to the Canadian border on foot in 6 months. I did the part from Colorado to Canada. And during that time, we listened to tons of podcasts. And apart from being a journalist at that magazine, I was also a audience developer at the magazine. So looking at new ways how we could engage with the audience in the digital space. And when I came back, I started developing podcasts, and there were two. One was for the financial part of the company, and the other one was about the digital health. And I really wanted to go beyond just Slovenia. I thought that was a great opportunity for the broader company, because the company was owned by Swedish owners, and there were many Medicine Today franchises across Europe. And I thought that going into digital health could be something that would connect them all. That's hence the English and hence the internationalization. But I then left the magazine. I still see myself as a journalist by heart, so I wanted to continue with the podcast. So that's kind of where the podcast came from. Now you can remind me about the second part of the question. Just
No,
so
I
I
was
don't
just
feel.
curious about your interest in the overarching framework of wanting to delve into the differences of various cultures, ideologies, belief systems, and why the framework, if you will, of the North American, framework, if you will, doesn't
Right.
necessarily fit all other countries.
Okay, so the US is the largest healthcare market. It's really interesting, a lot of innovations happening. That's why you've got tons of podcasts that are already covering that. When I started my podcast, I was in Uganda for several times. I was a volunteer in Turkey. I was traveling around a lot. And I was also a chronic patient, So when you're a chronic patient that deals with checkups and medical appointments, and the challenge of not being eligible potentially for health insurance, that's where obviously I was really interested. How good is healthcare in other countries, and what does that mean, for me personally? If I wanted to move to another country, can I even do that, or is healthcare going to be too expensive for me? So that reason was very personal, but I also believe that in today's world of algorithms, recommendations, where we go into different bubbles on the internet and are very siloed and very focused in terms of what we see and what kind of information we digest, that can give us a very narrow mindedness. And I want to go beyond that with the podcast by bringing on the show entrepreneurs, healthcare experts, policymakers from different countries, because I believe that when we see how different cultures address the same issues, or what kind of different issues different cultures have, that really opens up the mind and makes you think, and can potentially give you an idea about the solution that you're already developing. So the main kind of my mission is to bring a very broad view and to help people get a different perspective.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting topics, and I just love to maybe just jump in a couple of them and find out what your personal perspective is on some of the people you interviewed and some of these really great, interesting new innovations and ideas, and what your thoughts are on them. So, one of them that comes to mind about everything that we do and think, we're just thinking about the Amazon Alexa and Siri and everything, Cortana and all these other sort of speaking devices and chatbots and algorithms. Really just kind of curious about your perspective on the impact that artificial intelligence is going to have on healthcare moving forward.
Mm-hmm. It's without a doubt, artificial intelligence is going to be a new normal, a basic component of many solutions. It's very promising to see how AI could automate things, though a recent survey last year made by McKinsey showed that the healthcare sector is actually among the sectors with the least potential for automatization. There's a lot of potential for improving diagnosis, for giving patients recommendations, giving them nudges. There's a lot of potential about AI. We are still not quite there yet. And I think an interesting example of that is the interview that you're probably referring to, which was done with a news reporter from Stat News, Casey Ross, who analyzed the applications for AI submitted to the FDA. He looked at 161 applications that were approved by the FDA and compared the data sets and what the researchers actually reported. And I think less than 10 out of 161 of them had a structure of the racial composition of the samples that they used, and also the samples differed, from 150 patients to another study or another application that had 15,000 patients. Now, that's not necessarily wrong, because it also depends on what kind of solution you're providing. If you are developing a drug for rare disease patients, obviously you're not going to have the same sample in the clinical trial than you have for diabetes. That's a huge issue. But that research was a great reminder about how very mindful we need to be about the data sets and avoiding bias in the algorithms, because that's a huge challenge with AI. And it goes back to data. Who creates the data? How is data structured? Who's in the sample? So there's a lot of challenges at the moment, but I think given that we already see a lot of examples of AI being used, definitely one of the factors that's going to play a huge part in changing healthcare. I'm not sure, I'm kind of skeptical if these solutions are going to make healthcare cheaper, because apart from having this technology, apart from huge development costs, now we, on top of already increasing shortage of medical professionals, we suddenly have a demand for AI specialists, for data specialists, and this is an expensive workforce. So we will see how better outcomes are going to go hand in hand with costs for healthcare.
It's actually a great point, Tjaša, and I think ultimately it's not going to happen immediately. It's probably going to be more of an investment initially, because what we're really going to be doing is trying to transfer healthcare in terms of the health sickness paradigm to a wellness treatment. So going into more proactivity and leveraging things like wearables, ambient biometrics, liquid biopsies, things like that allows people to be preemptive of their health before they get sick. And hopefully, if we're doing that, it decreases costs on the back end. So on that note, I was just curious, you've actually done some work as well, or some discussions on your podcast around things like genomic testing, microbiome testing. What is your feeling on the impact that genome testing, et cetera, will have on people's long-term conditions, potentially even bringing that as early as, when somebody is born, having that baseline at which to assess everything that happens to him. What's your perspective on that?
Um, all those fields are amazing. Before the whole genome project, there was a lot of ideas about, once we'll have the whole genome, we'll know everything about the human body, everything will be predictable, healthcare will be solved, diseases will be solved. But we see that bodies, the biology and scientific advances show us that with every new discovery, we also discover new layers of complexity. So when it comes to genomics, you can have a predisposition for a specific disease, but it's the epigenomics, so the external factors that determine if something is going to get activated or not. It's very optimistic and very awesome to see the progress that has been made in genomics and personalized medicine, especially in oncology, where genetic testing can be very, very helpful in determining if a patient is going to respond to a specific drug or not. And that's now in the early stages of translating into other areas as well. And I think a similar thing might happen with microbiome. But the microbiome research is still in very, very nascent stages. We're talking about even larger numbers of factors that impact a specific correlation. And I think that's the overall huge challenge that we still have to solve in the medical research and in these advancements. And that is that you can have a lot of research on retrospective data. You can come to conclusions, you can talk about percentages, but that's always based on a sample. And when you have an 80% chance on a sample, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can translate that to an individual, so maybe you're in those 20%, so I think personalized medicine, the microbiome and genomics still have a long way to go. But as with many other things, the developments are quite optimistic. So it's going to be interesting to see where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years.
We're seeing so many other changes happening and a large centralization of all things healthcare based on the patient. We've talked about patient centricity for years and years, but I think now, since COVID, this is becoming a forced reality for a lot of people. Everything from decentralized clinical trials with the use of wearables and wearable garments and patient reported outcomes. You talked about, patient registries, real world evidence, to the potential of having patient healthcare records. I know that Better works on these, but maybe to eventually enter these items onto the blockchain where patients truly own and serve up the data to who they want to. What's some of your perspectives on this real, true patient centricity, all the models around it, around trials and blockchain, and what you think the impact will be in the future?
So I recently had a really interesting interview with a digital health lawyer, Bianca Rose Phillips. She's from Australia and focuses on Australia and the US law. And why I'm emphasizing this discussion is because we talked exactly about that, patients owning their data. And when you start to look at ownership from the legal perspective and what that brings with it, you realize that it's much more complex than simply saying, patients should own their data, or it would be great for patients to own their data. It's, for example, a very simple example is that if a hospital treats you, it's, in my opinion, almost impossible to expect that hospital will not have access to your data, because they have to have it for the liability issues. So I think we are not going to get to a state where the patient would completely control his or her data yet, but we are moving towards a direction where at least we're discussing how can we help patients access their data, have their medical record in the digital form, because that's one of the challenges that patients have. They want to be empowered once they have serious medical issues, and it's very frustrating if you don't have access to your information, because then you can't ask for a second opinion. And I think in the US that's slowly going to change with a new law that now I think demands all the healthcare providers to give patients access to their data in the next year or to the latest.
There's going to be lots and lots of regulatory changes. And quite frankly, we won't have time to talk about non-fungible tokens or the tokenization of data of other digital assets that one can actually own and put on Ethereum and actually get payments. I've heard of all kinds of things, even human IPOs, where people are investing in individuals and there are changes over time, everything from investing into their future income potential to all sorts of things. So it's going to be a mad world. It's going to be all very interesting. I'm also curious about your perspectives on things like virtual reality, augmented reality, the metaverse. Again, without getting into details, that some people think that we're already living in a simulation. But besides that, what is the world of healthcare as it relates to mental health? I know as a lot of us are emerging out of COVID with a lot of increased issues around PTSD, all sorts of anxiety and other sorts of issues. Where do you sort of see the advent or the utilization of VR or this next rendition of the metaverse?
I would like to highlight one thing when it comes to VR. So when you go into the virtual environment, especially as a naive patient, which means that you never had a virtual reality experience before, what happens is, based on research, you enter an altered state of consciousness. And there's been a lot of research done about altered states of consciousness, because despite them being prohibited, the psychedelic research is also on the rise. So things like, let's just say generally, psychedelics are research for PTSD and mental health disorders. And the interesting thing about VR when used for treating mental health is that it can have an immediate effect because of the this altered state of consciousness that happens immediately. So what I'm trying to say is, for example, a lot of mental health issues can be solved with techniques like meditation, mindfulness, but you need to train and invest a lot of time in them in order to get to a result. Whereas in VR, the effect can be immediate. It's obviously not a silver bullet. We can look at, how durable it is, because not all patients are naive. They're going to react differently. So a lot of open questions, but it's based on the research that has been done so far, and there have been over 5,000 clinical studies. It's really promising to see how VR is going to change the way we treat diseases. It's used for pain management. I think it's amazing that it was already in one of the clinical trials. It was used in child birth, so in labor, for reduced pain. And what patients reported was that basically the experience was shorter. And when I learned that I was quite surprised, because I have a 2-year-old son, so the memory of giving birth, it's still quite fresh for me, and I just have a hard time imagining wearing a VR goggles during that. But it's what's being researched, so it's really amazing.
It really is. It's so interesting that you say that. So many doors are opening. We're seeing a floodgate of changes very rapidly. There's a momentum and a groundswell of energy behind, healthcare disruption. Some of the populations that have been routinely kind of ignored or not necessarily involved in clinical trials, there now is a burgeoning interest in them. So we're seeing a lot of things like age tech, femtech, a lot of interest in female technologies. And because again, we're having a lot of discussions about inclusion and diversity. What's your thoughts about this opening of doors and including all peoples into the foray of healthcare innovation?
It's very promising for the future. I did a series about age tech and looked at various solutions that address aging, and it's comforting, for us that are younger to see how many solutions are emerging to make aging easier, to make aging in place easier. For example, a startup in Austria is doing a matching of caregivers and the elderly. So not exactly, but the easiest way to imagine it is like Tinder for the two groups. There's a 300 questions, I think, questionnaire that both parties need to fill out before they get matched. Because if you imagine that somebody comes to your home to take care of you every day, it's very important to find the right person for that. It's already difficult when you start losing your independence. And if when you're losing your independence, you get new people in your life every week or every month, just because you don't get along with anyone, that's very stressful. Also, new technologies that enables us to be in contact with the elderly, or new technologies that enable agencies and healthcare providers to really go to the patient that has a need. So it's not just routine visits once per week. That all has a huge impact for nicer aging, with better outcomes. So I think for our generations, we can be very optimistic about the increase in healthy aging, for us. So that's good to know.
Yeah, it's very promising. On the last notes before we close up today, this is all very well and good, and we are excited about all of the crazy innovation and disruption and beautiful things that are going to be happening for health and wellness, and really hoping to see the silver lining with all of the potential changes in the new world post-COVID. But the overarching question in all of this is, since we've seen this, what we call a K recovery, meaning the rich get richer and the poor are getting poorer, or the people who were disenfranchised or underserved or underprivileged were the ones who were most impacted by these series of events that have happened in the world. How are we going to ensure continued access? And most importantly, are we going to be able to afford the healthcare of the future?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's kind of two questions to that. We see innovation, for example, in the US, that is making healthcare more accessible and cheaper to some extent. So that's a good thing. There's a lot of innovation apart from the Affordable Care Act, which is a very general change that has happened in the US. There's a lot of new businesses, new business cases, new ventures that are trying to address access through healthcare, through innovative business models, and that's great. On the second note, I think the point that you mentioned, so the rising gap between the rich and the poor, is something that we have to think of very seriously, because digital health is not for free. An Apple Watch is not something that everybody can afford. And also, when you are poorer, you probably won't think about wellness. You won't think about if you're eating healthy, because you're going to be focused on just having enough to even afford some food, whatever food that is. So that I am worried that with the rising technology, we are going to get to the greater gap between the sick and the healthy, no, the rich and the poor, in terms of health outcomes. At the same time, I am optimistic that because of AI, we are going to see a decrease in the gap between the sick, the chronic patients, and the healthy, because when you have technologies that enable you to access physicians during your commute instead of taking a day off to visit a doctor. When you have solutions, algorithms, artificial pancreas that does or manages some part of your disease instead of you, that's when the disease burden really decreases and you can really focus on your potential, your ambitions as a patient. So that's one of the things I think is very optimistic. But looking at the future, we mentioned before, I do fear that healthcare is going to get more expensive because all these things are not for free, and it's still going to take time for us to figure out to which extent do they actually improve outcomes or not, to which extent we just think they improve outcomes, the same way as I don't think anyone anticipated what kind of bureaucratic and psychological burden IT is going to have on medical professionals. So there's pros and cons, you know. On the one hand, yes, the rising gaps. On the second hand, also a lot of opportunities for patients to take matters in their own hand because of digital therapeutics, because of new solutions and new opportunities. You know.
Yeah, so we're going to remain hopeful. And I think just reaching the top of the hour, this was a fantastic conversation, a wealth of knowledge. For those of you who are interested in connecting with Tjaša Zajc, anything that you're interested, potentially look into their Better platform, maybe asking about their MedsClub, or even asking in checking out her Faces of Digital podcast. We will be leaving her contact details in the show notes, so please be on the lookout for those. And if you were interested with this conversation, we encourage you to check out impetusdigital.com. We are the players. We've actually got a platform to allow people to build into these ideas beyond the pill ideas, big, hairy, audacious concepts, innovations, reaching consensus, building insights, and gathering all kinds of momentum around these things, being able to gather this from stakeholders asynchronously and synchronously through the Impetus Insight platform. So please check that out as well. We would appreciate if you can like and subscribe to our channel. And also, please be sure to leave us a review on our podcast. It helps other people to find us. We want to thank you so much, Tjaša, for your great conversation today. And we're thanking all of you for taking the time to listen today. Have a great rest of your day.